Hi, I'm PAULA GUZMAN, and I'm a sophomore at LIU Post. There is certainly a distinct smell in hospitals. The air is different, the people are quieter. Even the way people shift their walk to a more subtle and cautious march, like the floor will break underneath them if they let their foot drop too hard. As I was waiting for the doctor to come in and bear news, any news, I kept glancing out the large window in the waiting room. It wasn't the prettiest view. It was a small hospital in Queens, but we were high enough to see the roofs of houses. I looked back to where my aunt and grandma were sitting. My grandma had cried that morning. I think it was only the second time I had seen her cry, ever. There had been a lot of crying from the strong women that surrounded me. At 13, I decided I would skip my teenage angst years in rebellion against my mother and replace it with absolute love. Why? Well, because at 13, I realized that life is short and unexpected. I came to the conclusion that I should spend my life loving those who care for me. My mother was diagnosed with cervical precancer. The doctors had found a tumor in her uterus. In effect, they had to remove it from her body. I always try to pinpoint a specific moment where it hurt the most, but I had many. In my opinion, the worst kind of pain is the kind when you are absolutely powerless and helpless. How could I help my mother? How in the world does a 13-year-old girl help her single mother get rid of her pain? I tried my best. I went to my room or the bathroom when I felt the need to cry. I did the laundry, helped my grandmother cook, read her books, and loved her more. I stroked her hair when she needed to throw up, and I fed her applesauce when she was too tired to lift the fork. However, there is one thing that will forever be etched into my brain. The day she told me she was sick was as usual a day like no other. We had gone to Panera Bread, and we were sitting at a booth eating our sandwiches. I wish I could say I remember how the conversation ended up with her telling me the truth, but I cannot. All I remember is her bursting into tears. I don't even remember her exact words, but I do remember 5. What will happen to you? A woman, endangered with every right to worry about her own life at the moment, showed me that a mother's love is otherworldly. Unconditional love does exist, and it is shaped as a middle-aged woman with narrow eyes, black hair, and a name that translates to Behold the Sun, or Idalia. For as long as I can remember, it has been my mother and I. No, it wasn't in the cute kind of way where she planned mommy and me dates and purchased I Love Mommy jammies. Our duality was imposed upon us, real life and beautiful. Yet, having this mutual infinite reliability also felt threatening. It never occurred to me what I would do if my mother could no longer take care of me. What were my options? Living with my dad and his new family, no thanks. Moving across the country with an aunt I talked to a few times a year, again, no thanks. What then after? The first time I even fathomed the thought of my being without my mother was when I was 6 or 7 years old. I don't remember my age really, I was just young. My mother has suffered from kidney stones more than once, but this time it was different. I wasn't in a crib. She did not have a man living with her. She couldn't get up. My mother was lying on the old wooden floor of her bedroom, hanging on to a small trash can as she threw all her insides out. My grandma, who always came to visit at the most simultaneously perfect and dreadful moments, was there. But how is a 7-year-old less limited than the 60-year-old woman with arthritis who spoke no English and never learned to read, write, or drive? I was desperate and scared, and what does a child do? Turn to a parent. So I grabbed the phone and dialed the familiar number of my father, 516-225-2844. Hello? My heart rate decreased slightly. I begged him to come pick us up and drive us to the hospital. No puedo, estoy trabajando. He said, I can't, I'm working. Please, papi, I was pleading him. He gave me a number to a taxi. This was the first time I felt alone, ever. The first time I had to think of my future and my being on this earth. The first time I had to lay out my options in life, and it petrified me how terribly limited I seemed to be. Luckily, the neighbor upstairs helped me get my mother off the floor and to the hospital. So by the time I was 13, I was well aware of the meaning of independence, feminism, and responsibility. Of course, not entirely. It was only a teenager after all. However, life decided once wasn't enough for my mother and myself. It needed to reteach the lesson like professors do right before a final. Just thinking of that line gives me chills. A final. After a sad lunch at Panera where the sandwiches were a bit too moist and our drinks were too salty, we went home. Ironic as life is, my grandmother was visiting us again. I told you she has a sixth sense for these things. Now it was time to tell her. I don't really remember how it all went down. Like I said, my grandmother and mother are strong and fierce, and in result, don't really show their weaker sides. However, I'm sure my grandmother was sorry and said so. At that moment, I was still trying to understand what was happening. My thoughts were jumbled up in my brain, and I couldn't stop crying no matter how much I tried. We were sitting in our living room, and I believe they were trying to figure out what would happen, especially with me. How was she going to take off work? Who was going to take care of me? Who was going to do the driving around? I couldn't stand to think I was a concern in that moment. After that, it was just a waiting game. I kept on going to school. My mother kept on going to her job. It was decided that aunt I talked to on the phone a few times a year was coming from my mother's operation. My grandmother would be here too. My mother was getting increasingly nervous, and one time I even found her crying in the car. She was waiting for me in the old Honda Accord parked against the sidewalk. She was almost always one of the first for afternoon pickup and almost always got a good parking spot next to the sidewalk. Like most schools, afternoon pickup was insane. Kids running, cars double parked, yelling, beeping. It was usually the equivalent of the scene in Madagascar when the animals got to escape the zoo. Well, my mom was always there to pick me up in the midst of the craziness. I walked down the front steps and across a small lawn to get to the car. As I got closer, I saw my mother shaking. She had her hand clasped on her mouth and her eyes were closed. I started to walk slower. Yes, slower, because who would want to face that? Who would run to get near such a scene? I was scared. I was very scared, maybe too scared. But like most things in my life, what could I do? So I walked to the car and opened a door, got in, and just looked at her. Her tears were still running down her cheeks, and she was looking at me too. Te quiero tanto, mija, she said. I love you so much. My mother is a woman of few words, no metaphors comparing me to the light or the stars, but when she says things like, I love you, she has a way of saying much more than that. This story is for my mother, for every Hispanic mother living in the United States, for all the single mothers, for every child of immigrant parents who have to grow up a bit too fast, that have to understand the world differently, that have to hear things like, we can't talk to you, you're a minor, tell your mom to learn English, or feel awkward when the teacher asks, can we speak to your parents? Because you know they won't understand. My mother and I are warriors.